Okay, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Margaret Lynn, Director of Clinical Research Development at the Tennessee Clinical and Translational Science Institute here at UT-HSC. I, along with Dorita Brand, the Tennessee CTSI Director of Administration, want to welcome you to Research 103. The goal of this series is it follows Research 101 and Research 102, which was offered in the spring of fall of last year. And if you were not able to attend those sessions, those recordings are available on our website, and you can go to the search engine of the UTHSC website and enter Research 101 or Research 102 to find them, or you can always email me at M as in Margaret, LYNN at uthsc.edu. We're recording Research 103, and these sessions will be on our website soon. The goal of 103 is to provide some advanced information on research conduct. I want to thank UTHSC Information Technology. Xavier and Roger, thank you very much for all of your help. During this Zoom lecture, your microphone has been muted, and you can use the question and answer function to ask questions, and those will be asked at the end of the session. If there's some sort of technical difficulty during the session and we can't resolve it, we'll just end the session, and it will be posted on our website, and you will be notified of that availability. After the session, you will receive an evaluation of this session by email, and after you complete it, you'll receive a certificate of attendance. Be looking for that evaluation within 10 business days. Dorita Brand and I have no real or apparent financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. And now for the good part. Today's session is Research Contracts and Agreements, and our speaker is Sarah White, Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at UT Health Science Center. Excuse me. Sarah has been working in research administration since 1996. During that time, she has negotiated a wide variety of contracts, including clinical trial agreements. She's also provided training both internally and externally on many topics related to research compliance and administration. She has held upper-level positions in research administration at Harvard University, the University of Virginia, Emory University, Rice University, Augusta University, which is the Medical College of Georgia, and since 2017, the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. She has a master's degree in higher education administration from Harvard University, as well as a master's degree in material culture from the University of Connecticut. And Sarah, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be with you people today, and I look forward to questions at the end of this presentation. I need to make a disclosure, as Margaret just did, that I have no real or apparent financial conflicts of interest with this presentation. No commercial or non-commercial support is being provided to me. So without further ado, we're going to talk about research contracts and agreements. Okay, what is a contract? So a contract is an agreement that obligates parties to do or not do certain things, right? And it's mutual. Parties have to agree. They have to sign. One has to offer and the other has to accept. A very legal, and then there are legal considerations. So it's a formal signed agreement that binds the parties to do or not do certain actions. There can't be any fraud involved for it to be a legal contract, and there can't be any duress. In other words, you have to freely agree to do this contract, not be threatened into signing off on the correct contract in order for it to be valid. And of course, the subject matter can't be of an illegal nature or against any public policies. So when you're thinking about putting a contract together, I think the most important thing for me as a contract negotiator is to sort of try to understand the context of the agreement. What are we trying to do? And why are we trying to do it? So the first thing you want to do is, what are your goals here? And can we really do this scope of work? We talk a lot about clinical trials today, And I think that anybody who's attending this and has any experience working with clinical trials will know that one of the really difficult things with clinical trials is identifying that you have the patient population and identifying that you really can enroll patients in that clinical trial. That's an example about understanding your scope of work, the protocol. Can you do this or not? The second thing that you need to consider is, do you have the resources and the people to do this, to do the work? And is the contract going to pay you enough in order to do that scope of work? And if it's not going to pay you enough, are there other compelling reasons that you still want to do that contract? And oftentimes there are. But when you are thinking about a contract, you need to ensure that you know how much money you're going to get and how far short it may be falling, because you have to figure out how to get the money to do the scope somewhere. Okay, so remember that you have direct costs of doing business and indirect costs of doing business. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is a really crucial thing. If it's not in the contract, it's not in the deal. So if you talk, when we're working with partners and we're putting a contract in place, one thing that can happen is you get really friendly with the people that you're working with when you're negotiating a contract. And you have lots of conversations with them often. And sometimes there can be a disconnect between what was spoken and what ends up being written in the contract. So, and lots of times the people that are working most directly with the sponsors are in a department, or they're a clinical coordinator, and they're not in the office, back office like I'm in. It's actually negotiating the terms of the trial. So one of the things that we all need to do is make sure that we do eventually meet up and all understand that everything that was discussed did make it into that contract. Okay, and then the other thing that's really important is that with contracts is that if you start the work before the contract is in place, we lose the ability to negotiate effectively. So when you start work before you've got a signed contract, you have accepted the terms and conditions of that contract. Okay, so there are lots of different kinds of contracts that we use in doing research. We have master agreements. These are ones that don't have any money associated with them, but they are critical to conducting research. Master agreements, research collaboration agreements, material transfer agreements, data use agreements, equipment loans, and confidentiality agreements. So master agreement is when a company like Pfizer reaches out to the university or the institution and says, look, we do a lot of clinical trials, and let's figure out, or a lot of research agreements, let's figure out a way that we can make this process quicker. So we agree to all the terms in advance, and then when they want you to maybe do a particular clinical study or trial, you get the protocol. You have to get the IRB approval. You have to negotiate the budget. If there's any IP terms or subject injury, that's negotiated outside of the master. So masters are good in theory, but sometimes in practice, it breaks down a little bit because a lot has to happen when you're actually going to use them to implement a trial. Then there are research collaborations. They set the stage for researchers to work together. Sometimes they're legally binding, and sometimes they're just a shake hands kind of agreement. Sometimes they have funding and sometimes they don't. Oftentimes, research collaboration agreements are between peer scientists who want to get some background work done previous to having a full research agreement together or seeking funding together on a particular topic. A material transfer agreement is when we want to transfer, we used to call this goop. It's stuff when you want to transfer mice from one institution or another that are going to be used in the conduct of research, but it can also be biologicals. You may need some to transfer blood samples. We do a lot of research here at UTHSC with eyes. And so one of the things that we have material transfer agreements for is, for example, to get samples of patients' tears transferred to us. So we legally have custodial care of those materials being transmitted between one institution and another. Another type of agreement is a data use agreement. Data use agreements are under 45 CFR Part 100, 164. What that means simply is that if we have personally identifiable information or HIPAA information that's going to be used in research, then we have to put a data use agreement in place about how we're going to use, store, protect, destroy, or return that data. So oftentimes a data use agreement is required by the terms of an approved IRB protocol. And oftentimes you have data use agreements that accompany a clinical trial. Sometimes you have an equipment loan that's associated with a clinical trial or another research where in order to do the research, the company has to loan you a piece of equipment. And so these are sometimes agreements that are incorporated within the larger context of a contract, and sometimes they're separate contracts. Sometimes they're pretty simple, and sometimes they're pretty complicated. And basically, they just outline who owns the piece of equipment once the research is done, who pays for damages and repairs, is additional insurance needed, are there any safety issues associated with that piece of equipment, and can the equipment be used on animals or animals or humans? Okay. Confidentiality agreements have lots of names. They're called non-disclosure agreements, secrecy agreements. Lots of times we'll refer to these as NDAs or CTAs. They protect proprietary information. And so proprietary information means something under patent, or that's a trade secret, or that's exclusively owned and protected, or you want to protect that information. There are two different kinds of confidentiality agreements. There's a one-way, which is a unilateral. That is, for example, when a company, again, like Pfizer, wants to allow a faculty member, a researcher to review the protocol associated with the clinical trial, but that information is confidential to them. They don't want us talking about that information. And so that would be unilateral. If we're going to be working to collaboratively solve a problem for a company or do a scope of research, and we have some proprietary information and the company has some research information they want to protect, that would be a mutual non-disclosure agreement. Non-disclosure agreements are typically pretty simple to negotiate. They're usually a couple pages long, and almost all clinical trials have a confidentiality agreement as a precursor to actually negotiating a clinical trial. So what are the issues that we worry about when we're negotiating agreements without funds? The most important thing is protecting personally identifiable information or health protected information. Lots of times we want to protect the ownership of intellectual property, either theirs or ours. Sometimes we want the rights to publish. We don't want to agree to arbitration. If we're going to be sued, we want to be protected. And for state universities, we cannot accept governing law in another state. So those are usually the typical issues that we go through. So then we get to the contracts that we probably all enjoy a bit more, which are contracts with funding. And there are three basic categories I'm going to talk about today. There's sponsored research agreements, which we get for basic research, and there's clinical research agreements, and there are clinical trial agreements. And we'll talk about the distinctions between clinical research and clinical trial agreements a little bit later. There are also two broad categories of types of contracts that you can get. One is a fixed price contract, and one is a cost reimbursement contract. So what does fixed price mean? It means that you negotiate a fair price through at arm's length negotiation, and you say, okay, this is going to cost us $100,000 to do this piece of research for you. And then regardless of whether it costs you $200,000 or it costs you $50,000 to do that scope of work in that contract, you've agreed to a price and it's non-negotiable any further. A cost reimbursement contract is more what you see with grants and contracts that we get from the federal government. And so what those are agreements where you propose to do a scope of research and you propose the cost to do that. And it's a very clear and defined budget, but you're not guaranteeing that regardless of how much it really costs you, you're going to continue to do the research. Instead, you're saying, this is my best estimate of what it's going to cost me to do this scope of research. It may or may not change. And so you're only paid for the work that you actually do, that you actually bill for. Okay. So clinical trials and clinical research agreements. Clinical trials are usually for an experimental drug or device. There are 4 different stages that clinical trials go through. And when we're negotiating clinical trials, we need to be aware of what phase in time that experimental drug or device or biologic is at, so that we take into consideration the issues that come into play with that particular phase. Okay. So one of the things that the NIH has spent a lot of time working on in the last couple of years is defining what is the difference between clinical research and a clinical trial. And it comes down to really the word intervention. If you are going to affect a health outcome of an individual then it is a clinical trial. And I'll talk a little bit more about the distinctions, because it seems pretty simple what a clinical trial is. And we're talking about the distinction between clinical trial and clinical research. Both of those kinds of studies look at health issues related to human beings and how they can be solved. The difference with a clinical trial is you're acting on a human being. You're doing something to a human being, whereas clinical research, you're more likely to be gathering information, doing statistical analysis, looking at the electronic medical records to see if you can figure out patterns. That would be sort of the broad distinction between the two. So it's a clinical trial when the study involves human participants. Participants are assigned to an intervention. The study will evaluate that intervention, and there's a health-related outcome to it. The study may or may not require a comparison group or use a placebo. The study is only designed to assess pharmacokinetic safety and maximum tolerant dose of investigational drug, or the study as a biomedical intervention. This BESH is, if you go and look it up, it's a basic experimental study with humans. And so that is one of the categories of clinical trials. And the NIH has some really fabulous information on clinical trials and how to think about them. And I've linked to a couple of sources for information that are really interesting when you're trying to understand categorically what a clinical trial is. These are the different categories that the NIH puts clinical trials into: mechanistic, exploratory, a pilot or feasibility study, another intervention, or a behavioral intervention. So the next thing, when we're thinking about a contract, we really have to think about the environment where we're conducting the research and what we're doing, what we're thinking about when we're negotiating the terms. And so probably the easiest thing to think about from my perspective is stewardship, which is basically the care, how we are going to cost and how we are going to manage the financial aspects of the trial. And it gets fairly complicated, as many of you know, because we have to be really careful to separate out costs to ensure that the patient isn't billed twice and we don't accidentally bill the federal government for something that the study should be paying for. So that's a broad category of responsibility that we need to think about when we're negotiating the trial. We also have to think about biomedical ethics, right? So the right and wrong and why we're doing a clinical trial. We always have to ensure that when we're doing research, we're protecting both animals and humans. We need to make sure we have an appropriate compliance environment, and we have to make sure that we have ways to prevent misconduct from happening, or if it does happen, that we have mechanisms to deal with it. Okay, so the background information that's probably most important to clinical research is the guidance to physicians and others participating in medical research, which was defined by the Treaty of Helsinki. So it's the duty of physicians to promote and safeguard the health of people. The other guidance document that goes behind a lot of how we think about working with humans in research is the Belmont Report. And the key concepts it defines are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. There is more in the guidance, the federal guidance that embodies what came out of the Belmont Report is called the Common Rule, and this is what IRBs use. It's the regulations that we have to think about in approving the use of human beings in research studies. Another very important regulatory concept that has to be considered when you're doing a clinical trial is, are there any conflicts of interest or conflicts of commitment? So a conflict of interest is when the key individuals working on that clinical trial or working on that piece of research have a direct financial benefit to them from engaging in that research. And the classic case was with a trial where that was conducted at the University of Pennsylvania with and it used human gene therapy, and the company was owned by the doctor who was performing the trial, and people were pushed into that trial inappropriately, and someone died as a consequence. And there was a direct correlation that could be drawn by the ownership of that company by the faculty member, and cutting through processes to enroll someone that maybe should not have been enrolled. So we always have to be very careful to understand ownership and personal gain when we're looking at putting a contract into place. Another important regulation for clinical trials is that they have to be registered with the federal government prior to the enrollment of the first subject. And this is done through a federal tool called clinicaltrials.gov. So what are the clinical trial phases I was talking about before? The first stage is often investigator initiated. So this is before a drug or medical device has been fully, it's going through the FDA process for final approval. And so at this stage, you're really testing healthy volunteers in a very small population. You're trying to get your final preliminary data on how the drug will be tolerated, for example. So these are usually very small studies. Often the institution is conducting them and seeking outside funding for them. And so unlike most of the other phases of clinical trials, you'd be worrying about who owned the intellectual property. Other phases you're less likely to be because the product has gotten its final patent issued. The next phase is usually with 100, it's phase 2, it's the therapeutic and exploratory phase. And in phase 2 clinical trials, the study drug or treatment is given to a larger group to see if it's an effective drug, to further examine efficacy and safety. There are usually a couple of phases. There's phase 2A and phase 2B, and they're looking at tolerance and side effects. The main kind of clinical trials that we typically negotiate are phase 3 clinical trials. These are large multi-center clinical trials that are looking at broad segments of the population, and you're looking for side effects of that particular therapy, drug, biologic, diagnostic, to make sure that it's really going to work on all the different components, different age groups, different races, different ages. So we really are gathering what the side effects are. So I always think about this stage when I'm watching television and an advertisement comes on for some drug, and it says, you can have liver failure, or you can get a headache. When they describe the symptoms that you may get, the side effects that you may get, that's what you're gathering in a phase 3 clinical trial. These are incredibly important for getting new drugs and therapies on the market. Usually we don't worry about negotiating intellectual property or at this stage this we're just looking, it's a fully proprietary product, fully available to get on the market if it makes it through this final stage. The final stage is a phase 4 therapeutic use trial. And these are sort of aftermarket trials. Usually universities don't participate in these very often because you're just trying to see if you can get a larger market. Sometimes they're called post-marketing trials. So we have to worry a lot about, is this an anti-kickback? Are there anti-kickback considerations? So usually universities will not do these. Okay, so another kind of clinical trial variation is the term of art, which is called compassionate use. So sometimes there is a drug or device that has not gotten final FDA approval, but there's an emergency use for someone that may otherwise die if they don't get a treatment. And so in that case, we would use usually a material transfer agreement to agree to get access to that drug or that medical device to use in that one patient for that specific set of circumstances. I've seen these compassionate use is often used with cancer patients with new treatments. I've also seen it used with some frequency with premature babies or babies with heart conditions where there might be a new stent, a heart stent, or new something that there's really no other option for that person other than to try this really experimental treatment. So as I said, we usually use material transfer agreements, and sometimes these are very, very high cost. And so the MTA allows the hospital to charge a secondary payer for the cost because we've got approval for that experimental use. So here's the next phase of sort of how we actually mechanically do clinical trials at our various places of work. What are our roles and responsibilities? Who does what? So it takes a village, I like to say, because there are lots of different sort of streams of work that have to be accomplished simultaneously, hopefully simultaneously, in order to get a clinical trial up and running. So the most important thing for all of us, I think, when we're doing a clinical trial is understanding the protocol, right? So who are the people that are involved with that? Well, the most important person is the principal investigator. That's the lead investigator. That has to be a physician for our clinical trial. And then the clinical research coordinator is the person who is going to help that faculty member, that physician, to actually run that clinical trial. Then we have to have the institutional review board review the protocol to make sure and help prepare the protocol for review by the full committee or have an expedited review. We often have to send that protocol to the investigational pharmacist at the hospital or the place where the research is going to take place. Then you have sort of the administrative side of getting that clinical trial up and running. You have your contract negotiator. Those are the people that work in my office, in your sponsor programs or in your research office. And then you usually have a business unit, a department administrator that will be involved. So you have to, one of the things that's really important to me when I'm working on clinical trials or any contract, any research contract, is to know who the team is so that people can be simultaneously informed, we hope, about what's going on at the various stages of the process. One of the kind of best practices I like to have is if we can identify this team early on and have a quick meeting so that we all get on the same page with what the big issues and concerns are with what the clinical trial is going to be about. So there's almost always an institutional contract approval process, and you have to be able to demonstrate when you're doing any kind of contract that you have a separation of duties, that one person isn't doing everything themselves, so that there are checks and balances. So there's usually an electronic process, some sort of workflow where people review what they're going to be doing in the particular clinical trial or the particular research agreement, and they check off and they literally sign off, I've read this, I understand it, I agree that this piece of research can happen here, or I can't. There are a few times when someone in that chain of approving a contract will identify a risk area that is extreme enough that they do not want that research to be conducted. That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen once in a while. So who has to sign off when you're routing? You have to have the principal investigator, the physician, who's agreeing that they have read and understand the terms and conditions of the contract and the protocol. Their department chair or supervisor. I'm going through who has to do it here at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. Our dean or our dean's designee also signs off on the agreement. And then the institutional official, the signing official, someone like myself or the Vice Chancellor for Research, Dr. Goodman, ultimately has the authority to bind the university to the terms and conditions of that agreement. Usually institutions have a very small number of people that can actually legally bind the institution to the terms and conditions of an agreement. And people that have that authority or ability take it very, very seriously because they are personally liable if something goes wrong. Okay, so when we're looking at a clinical trial and we're putting the contract together, we have to look at the whole package of materials. And what do we need? What do we need to look at? We need to look at the clinical trial agreement itself. That's the contract. And then contracts usually have attachments. Most contracts have at least 2 attachments. One is the scope of work or the research protocol, and the other is the budget. And then sometimes we need to have an internal budget because sometimes there may be costs may be rolled up to a higher level within the budget that's in the grant, but we need to be able to put a budget into our general ledgers to show the transactions hitting against it. So sometimes you have both the sponsor budget and an internal budget. We always have to look at the informed consent document related to a clinical trial and compare that informed consent to the terms and conditions we've accepted in the clinical trial and make sure that those things are in sync. And I'll talk a little bit about subject injury. That's what we're really looking at. That particular term in a clinical trial is who's going to pay the cost if the individual participating in a clinical trial needs medical treatment outside because as a consequence of their participation. Who's going to pay for that? That is something that has to be explained to the patient. You know, you're going to pay for this yourself, or the sponsor will pay for it, or your health insurance will pay for it. Has to be written in the informed consent. That's a requirement. And we then have to make sure that it matches what's stated in the protocol and what's mentioned in the clinical trial agreement. So what sort of happens with clinical trials is you have these parallel tracks often where one group is reviewing the protocol, another is working on the budget, or several are working on the budget, and then another group is working on the clinical trial. And so before that clinical trial gets signed, one of the difficult things is to make sure you've got all those pieces, you've got the final versions, and they all relate back to each other. Okay. Okay. So clinical trial negotiations. Who are we negotiating with? Well, we're negotiating with clinical research organizations, and we're negotiating with sponsors. And we're also negotiating with partnering hospitals and other covered entities. So the clinical research organizations are often hired by sponsors to manage a phase 3 clinical trial. And when we're negotiating, we are typically talking to a clinical research organization. We're not talking to the actual sponsors. So we're doing some clinical trials with Regeneron, for example, but we almost never talk to Regeneron itself. Or if we do talk to Regeneron, we're talking to them through the clinical research organization, which is Parexel. So Parexel will take what we call red lines, the comments on the clinical trial and the budget, and they will review them. They have a certain level of delegated authority from the sponsor. So you may say for a specific cost in a clinical trial, you may say, they may give you a cost and say, okay, we'll give you $50 for a pregnancy test. And you say, no, I need 100. And the clinical research organization can look at it and say, well, we can only, the maximum we can give you is $75. If you have to get more, then we have to take it to the prime sponsor, Regeneron. But there are other terms that sometimes you need a difference in, that the clinical research organization doesn't have the authority to give that approval. And usually the clinical research organization will do the initial cut of looking at a clinical trial and then send it on to the sponsor for finalization. Sometimes when you have a contract, it's a multi-party agreement where you would have the university, for example, and the clinical research organization and the sponsor all signing it. And sometimes it's just between the entity that's managing the clinical trial, like the university, and the research organization. So we also always have to figure out, who are we partnering with? Do we have to have a service done that we have to pay a partnering hospital for? And if we do, how are we going to pay them? So we have to get their specific costs, and we have to take their needs for, say, indemnification or other clauses into account when we're doing our negotiation. So there are lots of bits and pieces to think about with all of the different individual people, business units within your own organization, and then externally, who are you needing to involve to make sure that you've thought through everything when you're doing your negotiation. Okay, so clinical research is a highly regulated industry. I think I've gone through what a CRO does. So at the beginning of, I'm sorry, when you're looking at a clinical trial agreement or any contract, you sort of have, they have a certain structure to them. So the opening paragraph is called the recitals, and that's a paragraph that just says it's going to be the University of Tennessee, and it's going to be who are the parties, who are we partnering with. That's the first paragraph. The second section which is also part of the recital, are the whereas clauses. What are we going to be doing together? We're going to be working on a phase 3 clinical trial. Who's the lead person who's going to be conducting the research? We just outline the key aspects of who's doing what and who the partners are in the trial in the first section of the agreement. Okay, so when we're going through a clinical trial or any research agreement, these are very long documents. It's a lot easier if you take them in small pieces and read each one separately before trying to put them back together again. But the clinical trial itself, they have about 30 to 40 terms that are pretty regularized that you sort of always see in a clinical trial. And these are the ones I picked out today that I want to just talk about a little bit, are sort of what are the main issues that you need to address within the clinical trial document itself. And one of the issues is the budget. And I mentioned that the budget is usually an attachment. It's incorporated into the clinical trial. But also within the clinical trial, you need to make sure that you articulate carefully who's paid for what, when, and how. Then we need, if you're an academic institution, you need to ensure that you have publication rights. You need to understand how the records associated with the clinical trial need to be retained and managed, and who's going to pay for it. You need to think about intellectual property. You need to think about protecting personally identifiable information and health record information. Excuse me. Subject materials you have to ensure that they're going to give you enough of the drug in a timely fashion to conduct the study, and it defines the responsibilities for that material. Then there's sort of an escalation of dispute resolution, arbitration, and indemnification liability, which is sort of what happens on a minor to major scale if something goes wrong. And then there's payer subject injury. We'll talk about that a little bit more, insurance, and termination. Okay, so this is a pretty dense slide. And one of the things I've done in this presentation is it's pretty detailed and there's a lot of content in here, and you might want to go back afterwards and sort of read it on your own and sort of use this as a tool that might help you when you're thinking about things. But this is important about the budget. So the budget is the financial expression of the statement of work. Those two things go in lockstep, right? And a successful clinical trial includes a budget that adequately meets the financial needs of conducting the trial. It's in the best interest of both parties to develop a clinical trial budget that represents fair market value and ensure they negotiate terms that will provide a fair return on investment. In other words, if you underbid, you're not going to be able to do that clinical trial, so you're going to fail to meet your obligations in taking that work on, right? So negotiating clinical trial budgets, we need to make sure that we've taken into account all the billing considerations as well. So the budget is a crucial aspect of clinical trials. So publication is another important term in clinical trials. For those organizations that are AHARP accredited, we need to ensure a particular level of ability to publish. In other words, the clinical trial has to allow for the ability to publish. So it's academic freedom. It's a core mission of universities that we have the ability to publish. And documents, our researchers must be able to document and verify findings. They can't be told what they have to agree to. We do allow in publication clauses always the ability of the sponsor to review a proposed publication. And within a clinical trial or any other research agreement, there's usually a confidentiality agreement terms which say this information that we're going to send you is going to be marked as confidential and you can't disclose it, nor can you publish it. And so we allow the sponsor the opportunity to review publications prior to them being published so that they can say, okay, we need to take out that confidential information that you disclosed, hopefully inadvertently. And the other reason that sponsors get the opportunity to review draft publications is to see if they think there's potential for an invention or something that can augment their intellectual property, and that would need to be either removed or we would need to work with them to get a patent and delay the publication until sufficient publications, sufficient protections on that potential invention are in place. So one of the things we're always negotiating in these is how long are we willing to wait before we publish, and what's a reasonable time for them to have to review publications. And we try to get them to be 30, 60 days, 90 days at the most. Okay, but with phase 3 clinical trials, most universities or institutions also agree to allow the sponsor to have the first publication. And so we'll agree not to publish until the sponsor has had the first bite out of the apple and can publish what they want to about the results of the clinical trial. And they have to do so within usually 18 to 24 months is as long as we will allow them to delay from doing that. If they don't make a publication within that time and we want to, or after that time is over, then the university will be free to publish. Okay. Record retention is always a term in clinical trials, and the purpose of a clinical trial is obviously to collect safety and effectiveness data for a given medical product. And so We need to make sure that we keep all the documentation associated with a clinical trial for a certain period of time. And those periods of time are both what your institutional policies may say you have to do in terms of record retention, or the company may want you to keep that data longer. So one of the things that you need to think about tying back to the budget with record retention is the cost of maintaining those documents, which there's a cost to it. So you always want to be sure when you're negotiating a clinical trial that you ask for funding if it's going to be an exceptionally long period of time that you have to maintain the records. So for example, if you're doing research with children, the records often need to be kept for at least 25 years. And so you want to make sure you have enough funding from the sponsor to pay for that cost even after the trial ends. Okay, so we talked about intellectual property. This includes things like patents and copyrights and trademarks and technical know-how. The creators of intellectual property are legally entitled to protect their property. So for University of Tennessee, we can't agree to assign the intellectual property that gets developed automatically to the sponsor. What we can agree to is that we are not going to infringe upon their rights. We are not going to use their intellectual property in any other way than what is stipulated by the terms of the contract and by the terms of the protocol. The subject materials, is any biological material of human origin, including tissue, blood, plasma, urine, spinal fluids, or other fluids that are derived from study subjects. So we need to make sure we care appropriately for those subject materials. And also we need to, other subject materials are materials that are provided to us by the sponsor that are needed for the study. And we need to make sure that sufficient care is taken of such materials, and that if we need materials to do the study, that they are, again, provided in a timely fashion in an adequate amount. Okay, so all of us are very concerned with HIPAA, which is the protection of private health information. And so we cannot disclose any information about a patient for any other purpose than what was agreed to by that patient in their consent. One of the things that we have to worry about, because we're a state entity, is that we can only agree if we're going to have a legal matter that we have to pursue between us and the sponsor. This is sometimes called governing law, and almost every contract will have a governing law clause in it, and it will say that if something goes wrong, the case will be tried in New York or in Delaware or in Texas, and state organizations can only agree to have things that require a determination of jurisdiction happen within that state. One thing that most sponsors agree to is to be silent, to just not have that term within the agreement. And so that used to be a lot more difficult, I would say, in the time I've been negotiating clinical trials. Now, most of the time, sponsors don't care a lot. They'll allow flexibility and they can be silent. Dispute resolution. So what if you are having a disagreement with a sponsor about how something is done? So taking a case to court is very expensive, and companies like to avoid it. We like to avoid it. So you like to have a little bit of flexibility, that they give you what's called a cure period when you can agree that you can work together to solve a particular problem without taking that issue to court. What we can't agree to as a state university is that we're precluded from taking it to court, that we agree to what's called binding arbitration, that by the terms of the contract, we say that the farthest any dispute can ever be taken is to have have it arbitrated by a neutral third party, and whatever that neutral third party decides is going to be what we agree to do, and we won't take the case to court. State institutions cannot agree to binding arbitration. Private institutions can, but often you don't want to limit your options. So most of the time, binding arbitration is a non-starter in a negotiation. Arbitration, again, neutral third party, as long as it's not binding, it can be a good way to solve a disagreement amicably between the parties. Indemnification is one of the areas in contracts for clinical trials where we probably spend the most amount of time in the negotiation. And what an indemnification is that the sponsor agrees to make you whole. In other words, to pay the cost if something goes wrong with a trial. Again, if something goes wrong with a trial, it's who's going to pay to make it right, and what are the terms of that. Another term that you typically find in clinical trials and in most agreements is an insurance clause. And it's to document that the parties have adequate resources to pay or manage all serious adverse events if they happen. So when you're looking at a clinical trial and you're looking at sort of the relationship of, I would say, a whole group of clauses, your dispute resolution, arbitration, indemnification, and insurance, those four clauses, you're really looking at risk tolerance, the possibility that things could go wrong, and what protections are in place between you and the company if they do, to remedy that. Another clause that is also in sort of that area of what you're thinking about is subject injury. So at UTHSC, we have an ethical stance on this consistent with the Belmont report, and we're going to protect human subjects. If a subject or patient is adversely affected or injured, the university and the participating hospital are going to make sure that that patient is cared for. And so subject injury says, again, who's going to pay for that if something goes wrong and there's a cost to an individual, they need treatment as a consequence of their participation in the trial. And again, this subject injury clause is really important because we must tell the participant in the trial in the informed consent exactly what will happen in the clinical trial if there is an adverse event, if something does go wrong for them, who's going to pay for it. Some trials we will do where we don't have a subject injury clause in them. It depends upon what that trial is actually about. And if the sponsor is not going to pay for that cost, then we need to make sure that the patient is aware of that, the subject's aware of it before they agree to participate in the trial. So when might you see us not have a subject injury clause? In a very low risk trial or in an investigator initiated trial, if it's our trial and we're getting outside support for it, but it's our idea, it's our protocol, but the company is interested and they may want to pay for that initial study, then we don't ask them to provide a subject injury for us. And again, we have to let the patient subject know that. Subject injury can be a deal breaker when you're negotiating a clinical trial. We have to be very careful that the subject injury clause doesn't create discrimination in terms of who can participate in a trial by saying only those people that have health insurance can participate in the trial, for example. So this is probably one of the most critical clauses that we look at when we're negotiating a clinical trial. Okay, so there's more information on that. I want to give you a few minutes at least for questions. Termination is a really important clause. We want to be able to terminate for convenience. That means that we, as the institution, may want to say, we don't want to do this trial anymore because our PI has left the institution, or because we found out we didn't have the patient population we thought, or we don't have clinical staff that can support it, or because we think that the trial is dangerous. And similarly, the sponsor wants the right to terminate for similar things. And that is what I have to say to you today. If you have any questions or you want to follow up even after this, please feel free to do so.
There's some questions. Let's see. Hold on just a minute. Okay. Sarah, do you ever compare notes and budgets with other sites, like multi-trials?
No,
That's all confidential?
it's confidential. The budget is usually a confidential aspect of the trial. So we
Okay.
will not.
What happens when you have underestimated your budget and you can't afford to do it anymore? So do you just terminate or renegotiate?
We would renegotiate and or it would terminate. Yep.
Okay. Who talks dollars first? You know, there's an old saying that whoever says the money first is the one who loses. So who goes first?
Usually the sponsor does. Usually the sponsor will provide us with a draft cost, a listing of costs, and then it's up to us to get our real costs and go back and forth with them to get a mutually agreeable price. It's a good question.
Okay. The question says, does UT specifically have a standard research fee schedule for study startup, study closure, storage of records, or other indirect costs? But that could apply to other institutions too. Do you recommend that?
In general terms, yes. I mean, you know, if you should have some generalized figures, for example, for what you think a clinical coordinator is going to cost. So on an hourly rate, because sometimes you know who the clinical coordinator is, and sometimes you don't, and sometimes your clinical coordinator can change. So if you have a range, an hourly range that you come up with for your clinical coordinator, you should have those kinds of things in your back pocket. And then when you're working with budgets, you also need to make sure that you've gotten accurate costing information from any clinical partners like hospitals or clinics as well.
Okay. What would you want a coordinator or research staff, those that are collecting the data and working with the subjects, what would you want them to know about the contract or the agreement?
Everything. I want them to really have access to it, to be able to read it. The most important things for the clinical coordinator to know is going to be the subject injury, how that's handled. You want to know the kind of the budget information, even if you're not the one, even if you're filling in a billing grid or you're just completing an online grid for what tasks have been accomplished. You sort of want to know what's behind that. So I'm a big proponent of everybody having the same information. And I always enjoy talking to the clinical coordinators and working with them because they have such a different perspective than, you know, again, us in the back office.
Margaret and Sarah, this is Drita. I think another thing is important for the coordinators to know out of the protocol and the contract, like the length of time that the data needs to be maintained for the site too. Because a lot of our contracts now are saying for 25 years. And so the coordinator needs to know that kind of information.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point because that's something we do in the negotiation. And we might go back to the coordinator or the PI and ask them and say, look, they're saying it's 25 years. You know, do you think that's reasonable? We try in my office to get the period to be no more than 10 years. And we try to get the sponsor to agree that they'll pay for it. But if the clinical coordinator or someone in the department doesn't know that we've agreed to that they can be billed, the sponsor can be billed after the study ends, then they may not be getting that money. That's kind of a tricky piece to actually.
Exactly.
Yep.
Okay, time for one last question. And it says, Sarah, you made a great deal for a Regeneron study at UTHSC. You must have great negotiation skills. Will you talk about some challenges that are particular in the negotiation process?
I think the first of all, thank you. And secondly, the negotiation process is always really fun and interesting. The most challenging aspect of any negotiation is sort of, well, there are two things. So one is making sure you understand everybody that's involved, everybody that needs the information, and keeping them adequately informed. And so that's the first thing, is to understand who all the parties were. And that was tough with the gentleman. We had a lot of moving targets. We had a very, very tight turnaround for some of these COVID studies, and they were complicated budgets. So I think that's the hardest thing, is figuring out who all the people are and getting them the information they need in a timely fashion so that they can get it back to you or ask you questions or identify potential problems. So the hardest thing would actually, I would say, was sort of the gentleman trial, was probably making sure we adequately got all of our costs done in a really timely fashion back and forth between the hospitals and the university.
Okay, thank you so much, Dorita. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, Sarah, thank you for presenting to us today. Of course, your presentation covered a lot of great information on contracts and agreements, and all this information that you gave us today will really assist us in having a greater understanding of this subject matter, because we all know this area of research can get quite complicated at times. And here at UTHSC, I know we're really glad that we have you and your team assisting us with our contracts and our agreements for our study, and we appreciate all the assistance that you give us. Now, Margaret and I would like to invite all of you to attend our third session, which is next Tuesday, the 13th. And this session will be discussing the use of the EDW and Trinetics when we are recruiting our subjects. And it's also going to talk about the use of REDCap when we are capturing our data. And we hope all of you can join us. And thanks again for attending today's session. And again, thanks, Sarah, for giving the presentation. We appreciate it. And Margaret and I hope all of you have a very great rest of your day.